right, so we are just going to finish up here from our discussion, whatever day it was, last week, about the influences that the British have on the American colonies. And I want to begin with a recap of what's going on with that Dominion of New England. Do you remember the name of the king that created the Dominion of New England? Who was the Catholic one? James II, right? So he creates this Dominion, and his purpose is, if you will remember, to try to re-exert some control over the colonists. There was already this feeling that the New England colonists were a little bit too independent. They weren't interested in following the navigation acts, for example. There was widespread smuggling. There was this sense that many who had come to the New England colonies had come because of frustration with things in England, like the Puritans, remember, who were here to try to create some exemplar city on a hill. You know, they didn't like the way the Church of England was doing things. So there was this sense that there was like more independent-minded people in New England. Anyway, the Dominion of New England was created and was received how? How well did the New Englanders like the Dominion of New England? Not at all. Good answer. Not at all. They especially hate Edmund Andros. When Queen Mary and King William, I did that kind of backwards, when King William and Queen Mary are brought in, they're these sort of Dutch nobles, right, who are sort of vaguely related to the English royalty. When they're brought in and named King and Queen of England, not only are they presented with the English Bill of Rights, here you get to be King and Queen, but you're definitely going to have to give us some power back first. They're also petitioned for the restoration of the colonial charters of the New England colonies, and they agree. But as we discussed last week, of course, the result of that is just like Nate would learn from throwing a fit and getting the cookies in the grocery store, the American colonists are going to learn that if they get upset about something, if the English government tries to exert authority, what is the outcome going to be? They're going to complain about it, they're going to throw a fit, and they're going to get things restored the way that they were. What would happen in that grocery store example if Nate threw the fit and I gave him the cookies, and then the next time we came, he asked for the cookies again, and I said, no, Nate, we're not going to have them. What would he do? And if that didn't work? No. The answer, you clearly have not spent enough time with 5-year-olds. I'll loan you mine anytime you want. The answer is he'd throw a bigger fit, right? If they throw a fit and it used to work and now it doesn't work, he's just going to throw a bigger fit. Well, to translate for the colonists here, why are you talking about your son, Mrs. Rodriguez? Because the colonists are going to try this again later, they're going to throw the fit, expecting it to get reversed. It doesn't work. And so they throw a bigger fit called a revolution. That's how it all works out. Anyway, excellent. Okay, so let's talk about European culture in the Americas. I'm going to skip ahead for a second. Here's a list of the top 4 cities. These are 4 cities in what would become the United States that as of 1700 had more than 10,000 people. Do you think you need to memorize these 4 cities and their populations? You do not. That would be totally useless information. However, I mean, maybe you would like win Who Wants to Be a Millionaire with that, but probably not. What is important is this. Look at those 4 cities: Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and Charlestown, which we now call Charleston in South Carolina. What do the 3 of the 4 of them have in common? They all 4 still exist. Good job. They're port cities, right? They're on the East Coast. So one of the biggest things about cities in the colonies is they tended to be at transportation hubs, which in 1700 was on a port, right? And Philadelphia isn't a port exactly, but they do have really strong transportation connections to the old world. And what matters about that is that in these cities, one might feel just as at home in New York, for example, as they would in London. The colonial cities, because of their really strong connections back to England, are going to have the same kinds of literature being passed around, the same kinds of fashion, the same plays, the same accents, the same pretty much everything there would be. Buildings are built in the same style, all of those things. So here's why we care about that. A couple of reasons. First, we talked about the biggest cities, right? So the most urban environments are going to occur generally on the coast, at the very least next to hubs of transportation. The second thing we want to remember is that we're looking ahead towards the revolution, right? Eventually the revolution is coming. Now, the revolution can only come when enough people in the colonies feel like they're not English, right? even if we're mad at our government, if we still fundamentally believe that we are English and like we want to be part of this big English family and we share culturally everything with the English, revolution is probably not going to occur. So although these port cities are strongly affected by things like the Navigation Acts and the Molasses Act and the Wool Act and so on, although they are feeling a bit of a tug, they're irritated about what's that policy called? That led to all of those acts, that policy that said that we need to exploit the colonies for wealth, mercantilism. Although they're irritated by mercantilism, it's tugging them a little bit. They have really strong connections to England, right? So we're not going to see revolution occur until the pull of frustration over mercantilist policies or whatever other problems they're going to kind of pop up, until that becomes stronger than this really deep cultural connectivity between these urban centers in the colonies and England. Spoiler alert, it's going to come in 1763 after the French and Indian War, but we're not there yet. So that's going to come later. The other part of this story then is that who are we not talking about here? Who are we not talking about with contact to London and all of this urban and consumer culture? Where in the colonies are there very few, if any, ties to the British? I'm not looking for the name of a colony, I'm looking for a place. Like within every colony, not on the port, but further inland, which we might call the frontier. Good job, excellent. Sure, so on the frontier, things are going to look very different. You might remember from your reading that the poorest people are going to come to the frontier. Often those in the frontier are immigrants not from England, but from other parts of Great Britain or other parts of Europe. On the frontier, there are essentially no connections back to England, right? They are living in a subsistence lifestyle, producing everything for themselves. They have a very unique form of dress based on their lifestyle and the sort of way they eke out their living. They're going to be in constant battle with the environment and in near constant battle with the Native Americans. On the frontier, we have almost no connections at all to Europe. So if we want to look and get an idea of where the American identity forms, why do we perceive ourselves as whatever we perceive ourselves as? Well, one of the first places we're going to have to look is on the frontier. Because back on the coast, back in the cities of the North American colonies, they look way more European than American. They're not going to perceive themselves as being distinct. So there's a lot of interesting social dynamics going on at the time. Last but not least, we want to talk about some of these political precedents. There is things about government that we get from the British that are going to be important here. And so the first is you can write these two things together, the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights. And when you write them together, I want you to write them with these words: limited government, limited government. And because I'm selfish, because I'll have most of you next year at an AP while we're here, we're going to go ahead and learn another word for limited government, and it is constitutionalism. Limited government or constitutionalism. Limited government or constitutionalism. So from the English tradition, back to the Magna Carta, back to that English Bill of Rights that we presented to the King and Queen, we get this notion that the government isn't above the law. There are rules for the government too. And you're probably going, well, duh, Ms. Rodriguez, that's the way that government works. Except for that, no, not really. Around the world, sort of, even now, but definitely back in the 18th century, it was not normal to expect that the government itself would have to follow rules. You know, it's like, I'm bad at movie lines. Something about I am the law, you know. The king would typically say, look, I don't care if you don't like what I'm doing. I'm the king. I can do what I want. And the king could violate anybody's rights, could take your property, could do anything just because of the virtue of the fact that he or she was the king. But in the English tradition, because of a lot of interesting factors, there really wasn't an absolute monarchy. There were these senses that there was this list of things, or these inalienable rights, if you will, that the government couldn't infringe upon. Okay, then, of course, we have this idea of Parliament versus the King. In English political tradition, there is the Parliament, the legislature, who has some power, and then there's the king, and they're all kind of at odds with each other, right? Not that they totally oppose one another, but the king might want to do something and Parliament might try to sort of rein it in, or, well, you can't really do that, or no, we're not going to vote the funds for that, or vice versa. The Parliament might want to try to enact a policy, and the king would say, no, I'm not going to support that, and I'm going to go off in his own direction. And the reason why that matters is because in our political system today, we have something called separation of powers. We have a separation of powers. We believe that works pretty well. It does work pretty good when we have separate legislatures and executives, when we have distinct parts of government, each with their own jobs. So from this conflict between Parliament and the king, we see the rise of the American political tradition for separation of powers. I'll say it one more time. From this conflict between Parliament and the king, the Americans are going to see and sort of pull from that and create our own political tradition of having separation of powers. Separation of powers. The others of these pieces are less important. We create our own local government, just as the British did. We believe in the idea of due process, so even if the king or the government wants to hurt you, that there's some trial you're going to go through. And then, of course, last but not least, we get our British citizenship from the crown. And that will matter for a while, because many of the arguments the colonists are going to make are, hey, we're English citizens too. And the crown is going to be like, well, but anyway, we'll get there later. So that's sort of it for those political precedents. So we're going to change gears and talk now about in relations with the Native Americans. Okay, so we spent the last, Friday and then the last few minutes talking about how England, or Europe more broadly, influenced the colonies. But now we're going to look at a very uniquely colonial situation, which is the relationship between the colonists, here we're going to be focusing on the English colonists, and the Native Americans. A couple of things. So first of all, spoiler alert, this is not a happy story. Does anybody think the story is going to end well? It's not. Alright, so the story could basically sum up like this. The white guys arrive, and the Native Americans try to resist white guys taking over. The Native Americans win for a little while, and then the white guys beat them up and kill them all. The end. Good night. So, I don't know, is that the way that kind of story is supposed to end? Really, that's kind of the trend here. But more broadly speaking, what we're looking to understand is how can we characterize the relationship between the English colonists and the Native Americans? So what is the dynamic that goes on? What we're going to find is there's a lot of racialized dynamics. So there's a sense that we're just inherently superior to the Native Americans, which is going to kind of define the way that the English respond to them. There's also a strong sense of division, of separateness, unlike in the Spanish colonies, for example, where there was a lot of intermarriage, there was a lot of working together. Even though the Spanish clearly thought they were superior, they still mixed in, they had communities where everyone was involved. In the English settlements, that's not the case. We see very strong divisions. And then, what is the result of that kind of violence, right? What is the result of the violence carried out by the English against Native Americans? How does that affect inter-Native American relationships? How does it change the cultural landscape in North America? Those are kind of the big questions. What I'm going to have you do as we talk is I'm going to have you put your pens down while I tell the story the best that I can. Here's the second part of the disclaimer, is that this is probably my weakest part of U.S. history. I don't know a huge amount of detail about Native American policy, so these slides have way more words than I've ever put on slides before. It helps me remember what the heck I'm supposed to say. As a result, I think that just like I get a little bit lost in the details here, I think it's easy for you to get lost in details. So I'll tell you each story, and then we'll pause, and we'll say, okay, what matters from that? What do we need to know from this particular story? So we're going to begin with the Powhatan Wars. Get your brains engaged. Where are the Powhatan? Which part of North America are we talking about here? Okay, something northeast. Can we be more specific? Sort of mid-east. Not the Middle East, but not quite north here. Which colony finds itself at odds with the Powhatan? Jamestown, okay, and so where is that? Modern day Virginia, so which region is that? The Chesapeake Bay. Good, so we want to kind of get our brains thinking when we see Powhatan. We know we've heard that before, we know that's related to those Virginia colonists, so here we are in the Chesapeake Bay. And you'll notice that the Powhatan Wars span from 1610 to 1614. They take a little bit of a break, and then they go right back at it, 1622 to 1626. So this is a bit of a hint of how things are going to look. So we'll begin. When the Jamestown settlers first arrived, they had a bit of an uneasy friendship with the Native Americans. They exchanged gifts. The Native Americans helped them with a little bit of food, but clearly the Jamestown settlers thought that the best way to survive the starving time when they ran out of food because of their failure to plant any, if the best thing to do would be to begin stealing it from the Native Americans who had otherwise been willing to help them. I'm sure that you can imagine this created a whole lot of really warm, fuzzy feelings between the Native Americans and the British. If you're thinking that, however, you are wrong. But things sort of have this tense, truth, I suppose, until about 1610. And in 1610, again, in a rough part of the year when there's not a lot of food to go around, the English are going to attack the Powhatan capital. They basically kidnap the chief's wife and his children. In sight of the Powhatan village gates, they murder all of the chief's children, for everyone to see. And then they steal the wife, they take her back to the compound and essentially force her to be a slave. And again, I'm quite sure that you would imagine how happy this made the Native Americans feel about the Europeans. But in fact, the real outcome of all of this was a huge escalation of conflict, where the Powhatans are going to have this big onslaught. They're going to, create a series of raids on English settlements, which is going to sort of make it even more difficult for the English to try to find profit. It gets pretty bloody. Eventually, as Pocahontas at least 50% of the way, the movie characterizes correct, John Rolfe, not John Smith, as the movie says, but John Rolfe will marry Pocahontas, the daughter of the Powhatan chief, and this will help to sort of end this first burst of tensions between the Powhatan and the English settlers. But unfortunately, that's not really the end, because pretty quickly it becomes apparent that the English still think that they have the right to do whatever they want. Here what's what they're revealing. Number one, they're revealing a whole bunch of bias, right? The English believe that the Native Americans are racially completely inferior to them, that they're just sort of a lesser being that exists for the sole benefit of the English. They're also sort of revealing a failure to understand how to survive in the New World. So even as the English get a little bit better at producing a profit, they still rely in a big way on Native American tribute, right? Which is a word for the stuff the Native Americans give. But the Native Americans might have called those things gifts. But if you require someone to give you a gift, right? You might willingly bring me cookies, once a week or something. But then if all of a sudden I decide that you owe me those cookies every week, and if you don't, I'm gonna give you a zero, that's kind of how you might be confused by how that turn of events happened. And that's kind of how the Native Americans were feeling, right? Why is it all of a sudden that we have to get these gifts? Anyway, in 1618, the Native Americans refused to pay. We're just not gonna pay that tribute. We're just not gonna do it. And therefore, the English began to sort of set out to just kind of take it anyway. They'll burn Indian villages, they'll take captives at any point, all this business. Well, the Powhatan get kind of tired of that, as you might imagine. And so in 1622, the Powhatan organize a coordinated attack. The Powhatan, by the way, is kind of a misnomer. We called the chief of this tribe that we encountered at Jamestown, we called him Powhatan. That's actually not his name, it's the name of his tribe. So we got real confused about who was who and what was what. And the Powhatan tribe is really more of a confederacy, more like the Iroquois. There's actually a whole bunch of tribes that are allied together. Anyway, in 1622, this whole series of tribes under the Powhatan Confederacy, they're going to attack the English settlements all across Virginia. We've since branched out a bit from Jamestown. This is the infamous 1622 massacre, right? They kill more than a third of all English settlers who are there. It's really bloody, but here's the thing. The Native Americans thought that what they were going to do was launch this really quick lightning attack. They were going to teach the English a lesson, and the English would learn, don't mess with the Native Americans. They are powerful, they are equal, they are strong. We should treat them with respect. And it would all be over. I mean, after all, the white guys, the English, had killed a whole bunch of Native Americans over the course of the years, right? And all these raids and murders and whatever it was. So the Native Americans thought they were kind of just evening the score, proving their legitimacy, and it's over. That's not how the Europeans responded. Right? What the Europeans did was respond with absolute force. You see, the following summer and then every summer after that for 10 years, the English got together and went on raiding parties and found every Powhatan village they could, and they burned it to the ground and murdered pretty much everybody inside and enslaved the rest. Mr. Pratt had a really good way of explaining this. He said, think about it like if an ant, you step in an ant pile and you get some ant bites, you don't just kill those like 3 or 4 ants, right? You go and get some poison and you exterminate the entire ant pile, right? That's what we do. And that's a very English way of thinking about things, right? They're lesser than us, they're not human. They hurt me. I don't ever want to give them a chance to hurt me again, and so I'm going to completely get rid of them, wipe them off the face of the earth. Unfortunately, bugs outnumber us like 6 billion or something. But anyway, we can try. We can make our dent with our one ant pile. Well, in a similar way, this is sort of how the Europeans were thinking, right? The Native Americans saw themselves simply evening the score, showing they deserved respect, and that was going to be the end of it. But that's not how the English sort of reacted. So, after that first summer of raids, sort of backing up a little bit, this is before the 10-year stretch. After that first, the 1622 massacre, and then the 1623 summer where they do all the raids, the Powhatan asked for a truce. They go, whoa, this is not what we were looking for. We thought that we were done. You guys heard us, we heard you, it's over, we all respect each other, it's not what we wanted. So the Powhatan, they asked for a truce, and so all of the warriors sort of meet with the English colonists. The English colonists poison the wine, shoot them all, and then go back to the undefended villages and kill all of the Native Americans they can find there. And then, 10 more years. In 1632, the Powhatan finally do agree to sign a treaty, but the treaty basically says, whatever the English say, yes. The Powhatan agree to give up all their claims to land, they agree to provide tribute at the levels that the English want to. The English do agree that they're going to that the Powhatans can do whatever they want to, like way out on the western frontier, but in practice that was never enforced either. So really the treaty in 1632 gives nothing to the Native Americans and everything to the English who kind of won it through brute force. So take a minute now and let's see what we can write about that. So we're going to sort of be writing under the vein of the Powhatan Wars here. The really only specific detail you have to know is of the 1622 massacre. That's an important historical event. So you definitely want to know of the 1622 massacre. The Powhatan are going to come, they wipe out 1/3 of the Jamestown settlers, all of that. But bigger than that, what are the lessons here? What's important about this interaction between the British colonists and the Powhatan Confederacy? You tell me. What do you think we should write down? What do we think is important? Well, what did the colonists want? What do they think about the Native Americans? Okay, there's definitely this sense of racial inferiority. What else? The colonists expect service, they expect tribute. Maybe the word demand is better than expect, something like that. When the Native Americans try to stand up for themselves, are they successful at first? Yeah, they're pretty successful at first. The colonists have no idea what they're doing. But very quickly, how do the colonists respond to any exertion of force by the Native Americans? Yeah, overwhelming power, right? The colonists are going to come back to any kind of, resistance from the Native Americans. It's going to be met with overwhelming force. Overwhelming force. So we're setting up a trend here, and let's see how that carries out to some other conflicts. 2 more seconds while you write. Okay, so the next set of conflicts we're going to talk about are called the Beaver Wars. These occurred in the late 17th century in North America, and I do want you to take a moment as you write the Beaver Wars to put a little asterisk next to it and put this is between Native American tribes. The Beaver Wars are not, strictly speaking, between, white guys aren't involved. I mean, they are, but they're not directly involved anymore. So when we look at the Beaver Wars, we're going to be thinking about how did, the existence or the presence of the English, how did that affect Native Americans in North America? So here we go. Okay, so this is kind of a map of some of the tribes in North America when the English arrived. So we've got the Iroquois Confederacy, who live primarily in upstate New York. We've got the Algonquin people. There's a whole bunch of different tribes that live around the Great Lakes. And then we have the Huron Confederacy, which is a group of 4 or 5 tribes that live in what we would call today Canada. The Iroquois are going to have some sort of mixed alliances. They're going to first ally themselves with the Dutch. And then when the English come along, they're going to sort of uneasily shift their alliance to the English. And really, the primary goal of the Native Americans in allying themselves with the Europeans is to get guns. That's really what it is. They want guns so that they can expand their territory, like relative to other Native American tribes, because they can do that to have more firepower. They expand their territory, they can get more furs, they can trade the furs back to the Europeans for more guns, right? So you can see that the arrival of the Europeans is going to change the dynamic even between tribes in North America, right? Even if the tribes have no contact, have no conflict at all with the Europeans, we're going to change the nature of intertribal warfare, for example. And I want to point out one more thing that will be important in a little while. Although the Native Americans do become accustomed to using guns in their warfare, they're still dependent upon the Europeans for the ammunition for the guns, right? Even after they acquire guns, they don't have independent sources of gunpowder or bullets or things like that. So they're going to have to still be reliant upon the Europeans for those to continue to supply their form of warfare. So it becomes like this self-perpetuating cycle, right? The Native Americans get sucked into interacting with the Europeans, and even when they realize that probably hanging out with the Europeans is a bad idea, they don't really have a choice anymore because culturally and societally they've changed, and they rely upon the goods that they have gotten from the Europeans. So this is sort of an interesting dynamic going on. Anyway, early on, the Huron, together with the Susquehannock people, I'm not good at saying any of those names. Mr. Pratt made me feel better by saying that nobody can really say them unless you speak the Native American tongues in which they would have called themselves. These are like the names that the white people gave them. Kind of like when your great-grandparents came to Ellis Island, maybe, and they got their name completely changed from whatever it was supposed to be to whatever it is now. Anyway, so the Iroquois, the Huron and the Susquehannock are going to defeat the Iroquois. The Iroquois are going to react to this by seeking stronger alliances with the British, right? They're going to go, okay, we must need more firepower. If we want to maintain our territory, we're going to need to get stronger. And the best way we can think of to get stronger is to increase our alliances. And so then, something interesting happens. I want you to ignore the part that says 7 years and proclamation. Just sort of forget about that for now. But in Europe, England and France go to war. I mean, for like the 5,000th time, all of you world historians. England and France like to fight a lot. But so England and France go to war again. I don't remember what it's called in Europe, but in the colonies, we called it King William's War. That tells you what? Did we think of it as our conflict? No, it was their conflict that we kind of get dragged into. So King William's War is fought primarily in Europe, but there's a little bit that bleeds that trickles over here into the North American colonies. And the North American colonists, the British and the French, they kind of drag the Native Americans into it, right? So now the Huron get involved on the side of the French, the Iroquois get involved on the side of the British. Ultimately, the British are going to win. Even though the Iroquois don't actually do particularly well against the Huron and the Iroquois. Anyway, the British are going to win. And the Iroquois benefit because since the English now have control of expanded territory in North America, the Iroquois are allies, get control of some expanded territory. And this is going to sort of motivate them to continue on the pattern of escalating conflict with other Native American tribes. So let's take a moment now and figure out what we want to write about that. So one of the things you should know are the 2 major allies of the British and the French. Who were the Native American allies of the British? The Iroquois, very good. The Iroquois were the major allies of the British. And who were the major allies of the French? Some, and the Huron in a bigger way. The Algonquin and the Huron are the biggest allies of the French. And what do we know about those alliances? Even if we're not talking about the Americans fighting the Native Americans, what is the reaction, or what is the result of alliances between the Europeans and the Native Americans? Why does that matter? Well, we have this alliance, and what changes for the Native Americans? Well, they get access to new technology, like, good job, guns, thanks guys. So, they're gonna have access to guns. That's gonna draw them even closer into alliance, right? They're gonna find their fates become mixed up in the fates of the European powers. For example, the Huron didn't really lose King William's War, but they lost territory because their allies lost. So we begin to see that sort of interconnection of fate. We see that the conflicts among Native Americans become bloodier, right? You can kill more people with guns than you can kill with bows and arrows, generally speaking. At the very least, you can kill them faster. So the intensity of those conflicts is going to increase. So we're seeing that European conflict is changing even the way the Native Americans relate to each other, much less to us. All right. So in our last 10 minutes now, we're going to talk about two big conflicts, the Pequot Wars and King Philip's War. These happened in New England. So the Powhatan Wars happened in the Chesapeake. We're moving northward now to New England, and we're going to see how those colonists fared. So the Pequot Wars and King Philip's War. And here we're really going to see the solidification of the exact same pattern we saw in the Powhatan Wars. So you can probably predict how this story is going to go. Yes, you can. Here we go. All right, so we're going to begin with the Pequot Wars. The Pequot Wars involved conflicts between the British and the enemies of our Native American allies. So we ally ourselves with a group of people called the Mohegan and then the Narragansett. It's particularly important to you. Anyway, the British are going to be allied with sort of smaller tribes, and these tribes have rivals in the Pequot. In 1633, one English guy, his name was John Stone, he's a smuggler, he was a really bad, nobody liked him, okay? Nobody liked John Stone. He's murdered by some Pequot Native American who he was trying to cheat in some kind of deal gone bad. But the British, they get a little bit uptight about it just because they're the British and they kind of have a big ego. I don't know. They get mad. And so they demand from the Pequot some tribute. They're going to get some money, right, some wampum, and they're going to get a few concessions here and there. Anyway, not a big deal. Kind of blows over. But just 3 years later, John Oldham, that's this guy, who was a really well-respected trader. He was a guy that everybody liked. He, in fact, was trying to work on a trade deal with the Pequot. Okay, so he was trying to smooth things over to help to reduce conflict and allow the British to benefit from and profit from more trade. And he actually gets killed by this Narragansett Native American who's mad at him for trying to go work with the Pequot, right? But the Narragansett convinced the English the Pequot did it. It wasn't the Pequot, though. But the Narragansett tell the British the Pequot did it. So the British get really angry, and I'm sure that you know what the next slide is going to say, right? That is to say that the English are going to go after and find and burn Pequot villages to the ground. Most of the Native Americans are going to escape, although they're going to have a really tough winter because many of their winter stores have been taken. And the following year, the Pequot are going to build up, they're going to gather a bunch of allies, they're going to attack a whole lot of frontier settlements of the English. They're going to manage to drive the English sort of back into more fortified areas. And we think that we've kind of come to an uneasy truce. Except for that the English don't really believe in truces. And so what they do instead is gather up an even bigger army, and they're going to hunt down the Pequot. They're going to sort of corner them. You can see up here, there's a diversion. They take a different path. The Pequot warriors are going to leave this fort. So the Pequot try to go after this diversion, that the English draw them away. So all that's left in the fort, called Fort Mystic, are a bunch of women and children. And so then the English, the main force of the English come back to Fort Mystic and they burn it to the ground. And anyone who tries to escape the fort gets shot immediately. And then after that, 650 Pequot women, children, elderly, all that business. Here's a quote from the captain of the British soldiers who was there. An act of our God, who laughed his enemies and the enemies of his people to scorn, making the Pequot as a fiery oven. Thus did the Lord judge among the heathen, filling Mystic with dead bodies. So they took 7 prisoners out of the 650 or whatever it was. So this is the so-called Mystic Massacre. After that, then, all of the allies of the Pequot are like, heck with that, we are not going to go against these crazy British people. And the Pequot themselves become marked men. None of the other tribes will take them in even as slaves. Because for the foreseeable future, anytime the English would come upon a tribe that was harboring a number of Pequot of any kind, they would then take it out against that tribe itself, right? They would murder the members of that tribe, they would raid that tribe, whatever it was. So the sort of result of the story is that most of the Pequot, they either die of starvation or whatever, or they basically sell themselves as slaves to the English, because none of the other Native Americans will take them, because the English went a little bit crazy, taking revenge for the murder of this one guy. Remember how it all started? John Oldham, that one guy. And remember that it wasn't even the Pequot who killed him. So there's that. So then, after that lovely preview of how things were going to go in New England, King Philip's War maybe is predictable. The Native Americans are understandably concerned about their new English neighbors. They seem a little bit crazy, and so King Philip, whose name is actually Metacom, or Metacomet, it kind of depends on which book you're reading. King Philip is going to begin to raise an alliance of Native Americans to push the Europeans out. Basically, the Native Americans have figured out that if the English stay, that the Native Americans are going to be doomed, right? No Native Americans can survive the English being here. These are not going to be good neighbors. They're going to try to take everything over. And so we need to get rid of them before they get rid of us. So the Native Americans, they try to sign some treaties, they try to figure it all out. When that's not working, they begin to plan a major military action. Metacom, who was known as King Philip to the English, his brother's death, his brother was more of a pacifier. He wanted to work with the Europeans and sort of find a way to find peace. King Philip or Metacom is not interested in that. And so he begins to pursue these military plans. When John Sassamon, who was a Native American who had converted to Christianity, he is put on trial in the New England colonies. He says that King Philip is trying to attack the colonies, and so he's put on trial. He's asked all these questions. It turns out that they don't believe him, but just to sort of be sure, the English are going to grab 3 of these Native Americans from this tribe that's being accused of putting up this whatever, and they're going to execute them as a warning, because clearly that's the best way to make friends, is kill some people. Anyway. And that's kind of the last straw, right? So the war begins. There are 10,000 Native Americans following along with King Philip or Metacom, but there are at this point 80,000 New Englanders. 16,000 of them who are military age, with 110 towns. I'm going to let you guess how it ends, and we'll come back to finish that story tomorrow, and we'll move on to doing some practice questions.